You're at a dinner party with the richest plantation owners in Georgia. The wine is flowing, the cigars are lit, and someone makes a bet that will change everything. I bet you $10,000 you won't marry your fat cook slave and treat her like a real wife for 1 year. Most men would laugh it off, but not Samuel Whitmore, because what started as a cruel joke became the most shocking love story in the antebellum South. A story so scandalous it made headlines from Charleston to New Orleans. What happened when a heartless plantation owner actually fell in love with the woman he married, as a bet will restore your faith in humanity, and what she did to him will prove that love can conquer even the darkest evil. This is the buried truth about Beulah and Samuel, the couple who defied every law, every custom, every rule of the Old South, and paid the ultimate price for choosing love over hate. So ask yourself this: what would you risk for true love? Because their story will make you believe in miracles again. Spring of 1854, Magnolia Grove Plantation, 30 miles outside Savannah, Georgia. Samuel Whitmore owned 1,200 acres of prime cotton land and 147 human beings he considered property. At 38 years old, he was one of the wealthiest men in the state, known for his ruthless business practices and complete indifference to human suffering. Samuel had inherited the plantation from his father at 25 and spent the next 13 years expanding both the land and his reputation for cruelty. He was a tall, imposing man with cold gray eyes and a voice that could cut through steel. The slaves on his plantation feared him more than death itself because he had perfected the art of breaking human souls without killing the body. But Samuel had one weakness that no one suspected: loneliness. Despite his wealth and power, he lived in complete isolation, surrounded by people who hated him and white neighbors who tolerated him only for business reasons. At 38, he had never married, never loved, never experienced a single moment of genuine human connection. The plantation's cook was a woman named Beulah, 32 years old, who had worked in the main house kitchen for 15 years. Unlike the other house slaves who were chosen for their appearance, Beulah had been selected purely for her extraordinary culinary skills. She was a large woman, weighing nearly 250 pounds, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that could transform the simplest ingredients into masterpieces. Beulah had been born on a failing tobacco farm in Virginia and sold to Magnolia Grove when she was 17. She had survived the transition from fieldwork to housework through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability with food. Her cornbread was legendary throughout the county, her fried chicken brought tears to grown men's eyes, and her sweet potato pie had been declared a work of art by visitors from as far away as Charleston. But what made Beulah truly remarkable wasn't her cooking, it was her dignity. Despite 15 years of slavery, despite the daily humiliations and constant reminders of her supposed inferiority, she had never allowed the system to break her spirit. She moved through the kitchen with quiet grace, treated everyone with kindness, and maintained a sense of self-worth that puzzled and sometimes irritated her master. The bet that changed everything was made on a warm April evening in 1854, during one of Samuel's monthly dinner parties for the local plantation elite. These gatherings were legendary for their excess, tables groaning under Beulah's magnificent food, imported wines flowing like water, and conversations that ranged from cotton prices to the latest methods of slave control. On this particular evening, the guests included Colonel James Morrison, owner of the neighboring Riverside Plantation, Judge William Preston, whose family controlled most of the county's legal system, and Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a physician whose theories about racial inferiority were widely respected in educated circles. As the evening wore on, and the bourbon loosened tongues, the conversation turned to the topic of miscegenation, the mixing of races. Judge Preston was holding forth on the natural revulsion that white men felt toward black women, declaring it a biological impossibility for a civilized man to feel genuine attraction to an inferior race. Dr. Thornfield agreed enthusiastically, adding his scientific opinion that such unions were not only morally repugnant, but physically impossible for a man of refinement. Gentlemen simply cannot override his natural instincts, he declared with authority. It would be like asking him to marry a farm animal. Colonel Morrison, already deep in his cups, looked across the table at Samuel with a wicked gleam in his eye. Speaking of impossibilities, he said slowly, I'd wager our host here couldn't spend a single week treating that fat cook of his like a real woman, much less marry her. The table fell silent. Even in their drunken state, the men recognized that Morrison had crossed a line. But the colonel wasn't finished. In fact, he continued, reaching into his jacket for his wallet, I'll bet $10,000 that Samuel Whitmore couldn't marry his cook and treat her like a genuine wife for 1 full year. Not just ceremony, I mean living together, eating together, presenting her in public as Mrs. Whitmore. $10,000 in 1854 was equivalent to nearly $400,000 today. It was enough money to buy another plantation, enough to change a man's entire life. The room buzzed with excitement as the other men considered the implications of such a wager. Samuel stared at Morrison for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. The idea was preposterous, scandalous, potentially ruinous to his social standing. Marriage between white and black was illegal in Georgia, punishable by imprisonment and social exile. Even if he could find a way around the legal obstacles, the social consequences would be devastating. But something about the challenge appealed to Samuel's gambling nature. He had built his fortune on calculated risks, on doing things other men wouldn't dare. And the money was more than tempting. It was life-changing. You're serious about this? Samuel asked quietly. Dead serious, Morrison replied. $10,000 says you can't do it. 1 year of marriage, living as husband and wife, presenting her publicly as your equal. The whole county watching to see if the great Samuel Whitmore has the stomach for it. Judge Preston leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Of course, you'd need to make it legal somehow. Can't just play house and call it marriage. Dr. Thornfield nodded sagely. And it would have to be genuine. Not just keeping her locked away. Public appearances, social functions, the full treatment of a plantation mistress. Samuel's mind was racing. The legal obstacles were significant, but not insurmountable. There were ways around Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws, loopholes that a clever lawyer could exploit. The social consequences would be severe, but he had never cared much about what other people thought anyway. More importantly, something about the challenge excited him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The idea of shocking the entire South, of doing something so outrageous that it would be talked about for generations, appealed to his vanity and his need for attention. Make it 15,000, Samuel said suddenly, and I'll do it. The room erupted in excited chatter as Morrison eagerly agreed to the increased stakes. Papers were drawn up that very evening, with Judge Preston serving as the official witness and Dr. Thornfield recording the medical particulars of the experiment. The terms were clear. Samuel had to legally marry Beulah and live with her as a genuine husband and wife for exactly 1 year, treating her in all respects as the mistress of Magnolia Grove Plantation. The next morning, Samuel woke with a pounding headache and the sudden realization of what he had committed himself to. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down, and the money was too substantial to ignore. He had made the bet, and now he would have to see it through. His first challenge was the legal aspect of the marriage. Georgia law strictly prohibited marriages between white and black individuals, with penalties that included imprisonment and heavy fines. But Samuel's lawyer, a clever man named Josiah Fletcher, found a potential loophole in an obscure 1820s statute that allowed marriages performed in international waters to be recognized by the state. The solution was as expensive as it was elaborate. Samuel chartered a ship, officially registering it under Jamaican law, and arranged for a ceremony to be performed 12 miles off the Georgia coast. The captain, properly bribed and legally authorized to perform marriages under maritime law, would conduct the ceremony in international waters, where Georgia's anti-miscegenation statutes held no power. But the more complicated challenge was Beulah herself. Samuel had never had a personal conversation with his cook beyond giving orders about meals. She knew nothing about the bet, nothing about his plans, nothing about the social experiment she was about to become the centerpiece of. When Samuel finally approached Beulah in the kitchen, 3 days after making the bet, she was preparing dinner for his usual Thursday evening guests. He watched her work for several minutes, noting for the first time the grace with which she moved despite her size, the care she took with every dish, the quiet dignity that surrounded her like an invisible cloak. "Beulah," he said finally, causing her to look up in surprise. Masters rarely entered the kitchen, and never to make casual conversation. "Yes, Master Samuel," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron and lowering her eyes respectfully. "I have a proposition for you." Samuel began, then stopped. realizing how absurd his next words would sound. "I want you to marry me." Beulah stared at him for a long moment, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, Master Samuel, but I don't understand." Samuel took a deep breath and explained the entire situation, the bet, the money, the legal arrangements he was making. He was honest about his motivations, explaining that this was initially a business arrangement that would benefit them both. She would gain legal freedom and social status, while he would win a substantial sum of money. "And after the year is over?" Beulah asked quietly. "You'll be a free woman with enough money to go anywhere. Do anything you want," Samuel replied. "I'll make sure you're well provided for." He was quiet for a long time, stirring a pot of soup, while she considered his proposal. Whose proposal? The offer of freedom was tempting beyond description, but she wasn't naive about the dangers. A black woman married to a white man in Georgia, even temporarily, would face threats and violence from every direction. "What would be expected of me?" she asked finally. "You'd live in the main house as my wife, accompany me to social functions, run the household as the plantation mistress. For all public purposes, you'd be Mrs. Samuel Whitmore." And privately, Samuel hesitated. This was the aspect of the arrangement he hadn't fully considered. "We'd live as husband and wife in all respects," he said carefully. "The bet requires that it be genuine." Beulah nodded slowly, understanding the full implications. "And you believe you can do this? Treat a black woman as your equal for an entire year." The question caught Samuel off guard. In his arrogance, he had assumed the challenge would be entirely on her side, that she would be grateful for the opportunity and eager to please. It hadn't occurred to him that she might doubt his ability to honor the arrangement. "I keep my word," he said stiffly. "That's not what I asked," Beulah replied, meeting his eyes for the first time in the conversation. "I asked if you can treat me as an equal. There's a difference between keeping a promise and changing your heart." The insight surprised Samuel. He had expected gratitude, maybe fear, possibly excitement about the opportunity for freedom. He hadn't expected philosophical depth or the suggestion that his own transformation might be the greater challenge. "I suppose we'll find out," he said finally. Beulah considered his offer for 3 more days, during which Samuel found himself paying unprecedented attention to her daily routines. He watched her supervise the kitchen staff with quiet authority, saw how the other house slaves respected and trusted her judgment, noticed the way she could diffuse tensions with a gentle word or knowing look. When she finally accepted his proposal, it was with conditions that surprised him. She wanted assurance that the other slaves on the plantation would not face retaliation for the arrangement. She insisted on continuing to work in the kitchen, explaining that cooking was not just her skill, but her passion. And she demanded that he treat her with genuine respect, not just the performance of respect for public consumption. "If we're going to do this," she said firmly, "it has to be real. I won't be your pet or your experiment. If I'm to be your wife, even temporarily, then you must treat me as your wife deserves to be treated." The wedding took place on a cloudy Saturday morning in May 1854, aboard the merchant vessel Southern Star in international waters off the Georgia coast. Samuel had invited Morrison, Preston, and Thornfield to witness the ceremony, along with their wives who came more out of morbid curiosity than social support. Beulah wore a simple white dress that Samuel had commissioned from the finest seamstress in Savannah, and despite her size and dark skin, she was undeniably beautiful. She had spent hours preparing for the ceremony, understanding that this moment would be discussed and debated throughout the South for years to come. The ceremony itself was brief and awkward, with Captain Mackenzie performing his duties with professional efficiency while the wedding guests maintained shocked silence. When the captain pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Beulah's cheek chastely, and the deed was done. The real test began when they returned to Magnolia Grove as Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Whitmore. The reaction from the other slaves was mixed and complex. Some were genuinely happy for Beulah, seeing her elevation as a victory for their entire community. Others were resentful, viewing her new status as a betrayal of racial solidarity. Most were simply confused, unable to understand how the social order they had lived under their entire lives could change so suddenly and completely. The white community's reaction was far more uniformly hostile. Within days of the ceremony, Samuel and Beulah were being discussed in every parlor, every church, every social gathering from Savannah to Augusta. The words used to describe them ranged from scandalous to disgusting, to an abomination against God and nature. Social invitations stopped arriving at Magnolia Grove. Business associates began finding excuses to avoid meetings. Even the local minister refused to acknowledge the marriage, declaring it invalid in the eyes of God regardless of its legal status. But the most surprising development was happening within Samuel himself. Living day by day with Beulah as his wife, he began to discover aspects of her personality that 15 years of master-slave interaction had never revealed. She was remarkably intelligent, with insights into human nature that often startled him. She had a dry sense of humor that could make him laugh despite himself. She was well-read, having secretly learned to read and write years earlier, and could discuss literature, politics, and philosophy with a sophistication that rivaled any of his previous social companions. Most surprisingly, she was kind to him in ways no one had been since his childhood. She listened to his concerns about the plantation, offered thoughtful advice about business decisions, and created a sense of home in the big house that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his adult life, Samuel looked forward to coming home each evening. Dinner became a pleasure rather than a solitary chore. Conversations by the fireplace stretched late into the night, covering subjects he had never imagined discussing with a woman, much less a former slave. 3 months into their marriage, Samuel realized something that terrified him. He was falling in love with his wife. It wasn't just physical attraction, though he had discovered that Beulah's size and dark skin did nothing to diminish her femininity or desirability. It was something deeper, a recognition that she possessed qualities of character and spirit that made her more worthy of respect than any woman he had ever known. The revelation came during a dinner party they hosted for some visiting cotton merchants from Charleston. Samuel had insisted on presenting Beulah as his wife, despite the obvious discomfort of his guests, and he watched with growing pride as she handled their barely concealed hostility with grace and dignity. When one of the merchants made a particularly crude comment about unusual tastes in women, Beulah responded with such wit and intelligence that the man was left speechless. Samuel found himself not just defending her, but genuinely admiring her strength and composure. News of Samuel's genuine affection for his wife spread through the white community like wildfire, transforming what had been viewed as an eccentric bet into something far more threatening. A white man who married a black woman as a joke was scandalous, but ultimately harmless. A white man who genuinely loved a black woman was a direct threat to the entire social order. The pressure began subtly. Canceled business contracts. Social ostracism, whispered threats. But it escalated quickly when Samuel began making it clear that he intended to honor his marriage permanently, not just for the duration of the bet. Colonel Morrison, who had initiated the entire arrangement, was among the most outraged. He had expected to watch Samuel struggle through a year of pretense and then collect his winnings while Samuel returned to normal life with an entertaining story to tell. The possibility that the marriage might become permanent was not part of the plan. "You've lost your mind, Samuel," Morrison declared during a heated confrontation at the Savannah Cotton Exchange. "This was supposed to be a joke, not a permanent arrangement. You're destroying yourself and everyone associated with you." But Samuel was past caring about social consequences. For the first time in his life, he had found genuine happiness, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice it for the approval of people he had never particularly liked anyway. The crisis came to a head in the fall of 1854, when Beulah announced she was pregnant. The news of a potential mixed-race child sent shockwaves through the entire region. What had been scandalous was now viewed as catastrophic. The idea of Samuel Whitmore's heir being a mulatto child was more than polite society could tolerate. The threats became specific and immediate. Anonymous letters warned Samuel that his wife and unborn child would not be safe if they remained in Georgia. Business partners issued ultimatums demanding he end the marriage immediately. Samuel and Beulah died together, holding hands in their bedroom, overcome by smoke before they could escape. Their bodies were found the next morning by slaves who had watched helplessly as their master's house burned, knowing that any attempt to help would result in their own deaths. The official investigation concluded that the fire was accidental, caused by an overturned lamp. No arrests were made, no charges filed. The story was quietly buried along with the couple, and within months it was as if Samuel and Beulah Whitmore had never existed. But their love story lived on in whispered tales passed down through generations of former slaves. They spoke of the master who learned to love, and the woman who taught him how. They remembered the year when racial barriers seemed to dissolve, when love proved stronger than hate, when two people showed that human connection could transcend even the most entrenched social divisions. Colonel Morrison kept the $15,000, claiming Samuel had failed to complete the full year of marriage. But those who knew the truth understood that Samuel had won something far more valuable than money. He had discovered what it meant to love and be loved without conditions, without reservations, without regard for the opinions of a world built on hatred and division. Today, nothing remains of Magnolia Grove Plantation except some crumbling foundations and a small cemetery where two unmarked graves lie side by side. Local historians have no record of Samuel and Beulah Whitmore, their marriage, but in the oral traditions of African American communities throughout Georgia, their story persists as a testament to love's power to transform even the most hardened hearts. They remember Beulah, who showed that dignity and grace could flourish even in the soil of bondage. And they remember Samuel, who proved that redemption was possible, even for those who seemed beyond saving. In a world built on the premise that love across racial lines was impossible, Samuel and Beulah proved that love recognizes no boundaries, respects no artificial divisions, and conquers even the most deeply rooted hatred. Their story reminds us that the most revolutionary act in a world built on division is simply to love without conditions. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of revolution the world needs most. The bet that started as a cruel joke became the greatest love story never told. Because in the end, love didn't just conquer hate. It transformed it into something beautiful, something worthy, something that burned brighter than the flames that tried to destroy it.